Hello everyone, my name is Connor Matson from Brightbridge Web, and today I woke up with with a face that looked like this. Wow, do you see what I have here? Oh, it's right there and right there. Wow, that's disgusting. Good thing I didn't come into work today. But what I really woke up doing was kind of wanting to give you guys a tutorial on Mako. And Mako is a really important part of Django Mako Plus. That's it's part of the title. It's like the middle fragment. Um, the Mako in Django Mako Plus refers to the kind of front end manipulation and dynamic content that can be pulled from our backend, Django. And so Mako, I guarantee most of you who have done a DMP project before have used Mako. If you're calling a variable in from the context, for example, which is like one of the most basic things you can do in Mako, that's an example of pulling content in from the back end to the front end. So this is a great starter for anyone who's working on DMP projects because you can kind of learn how everything connects to each other, right? How the front end connects to the back end and how all the front end links together in and of itself. And we're going to talk about all that today in a way that'll help you prepare for your upcoming test, or just to help you be motivated to learn more about Django and how to make these projects for yourself and in your employment. So with that being said, we're going to go through 7 sections today of different Mako kind of standards and practices, and hopefully these will give you a great understanding of what you can do in Mako, and hopefully like it did for me, hopefully you'll learn a little bit more than you did coming into the video. That being said though, there might be some things that you already know in this video, so I'm going to put all of the timestamps in the description below for all of the different kind of segments of the video. So if there's something you don't know, you can just jump to that segment and go ahead and watch from there. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a naked Django Mako Plus project. So if you just created a brand new app in Django Mako Plus, we're going to be working right from there. So you don't need any special code or anything. Just exactly what you get when you install a Django Mako Plus project. If you haven't done that yet, feel free to refer to the DMP documentation, which is also in the description below, or the video that Enoch made on how to set up a Django environment and a Django project. With that being said, I'm so excited to talk about Mako with you guys today, and let me know your thoughts on this video, because there are going to be more videos to come that will hopefully help you learn and grow as a developer and a person in this framework that isn't exactly widely documented, which is why we're here to kind of help you guys out and hopefully give you a better understanding. So if you have any questions or suggestions for me in real life, please feel free to let me know. Thank you so much, guys, and I hope you enjoyed the video. So once you've created a new Django Mako Plus project, as well as installed Django Mako Plus on your computer and make sure that the server is up and running, let's go ahead and drag the folder of the project into a code editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code right now, but you can use whatever you want. If you go over to the folder and open it, you'll see that we have kind of this structure here, right? We have our app, which we defined when we created the project, and typically it's named homepage for your first app. And so I'll assume that you have a folder called homepage as well. So go ahead and open up homepage. And within homepage, you'll see a folder called templates. And we're going to be working a lot in templates today. Templates are where all the HTML is stored in a Django project. And by default, you start out with 3 of these files. You start out with base_ajax.htm, base.htm, and index.html. Today we're going to be talking mainly about base.htm and index.htm. So go ahead and open both of those up. Also make sure that your server is running and that you are connected to the server so that you can refresh the page and it will load up your code. So let's take a look at this kind of default site that Django's given us to start with. We have a Python logo and a little header that says welcome to DMP. We also have some text that says congratulations, you've successfully created a new DMP app, and then gives us the current timestamp, which is really cool. So what we can do is let's go ahead and kind of figure out where everything is, just since we're getting started here, right? This looks like your typical HTML document in base.htm, right? So we have our doc type defined, we have HTML, right? We have our head tag, our body tag. We can presume that our content is within the body tag. So let's look at the header, right? within our header, we have this Python image that we just saw on our homepage right here. And then we also have a message that says "Welcome to DMP," and that all lines up and looks great, right? And then we go down, we see this main tag that's got a block inside of it, and this is called a Mako block, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So let's skip that for now. And then we have the footer, and the footer has 2 links. And if you go back to your browser, you'll see that there are 2 links down here in the bottom right section of the page, and those correspond with that, right? But the real question is, where did all this stuff kind of in the middle go, right? Where is that? And the answer is it's in index.html, right? And so within index.html, we see a very different structure than we saw in base.htm, right? Base.htm follows proper HTML5 protocols, right? Having a doc type, an HTML tag, a head tag, body tag, right? Looks pretty like W3C compliant, that kind of thing, semantic tags. And then we go over to index.html, and it's a file that starts with 8 lines in it, right? That's kind of small for what we think to be an HTML file, right? And so it's interesting though, because within this file we see congratulations, you successfully created a new DMP app, right? And that's right here. So what kind of happens happens in this whole process in Django is that it looks to be that base.htm and index.html HTML kind of merged together to form this web page right here. And to give you a better understanding of what we're actually looking at here, let's navigate to /index. And when you do that, you'll see that we're on the exact same page. So at the start of the project, when you're at the root URL, which is this right here, you'll note that it's the exact same thing. The root URL is the same as index because index is set to the default template in your settings. And so you're navigating to index, and then base is just somewhere kind of like floating around, I guess, right? That's kind of what we have to figure out here, right? And so the way that this all works is through a concept called inheritance. And this is an important term to kind of note and make sure that you really nail if you're going to learn Mako and DMP, because inheritance is a really big part of code and will save you a lot of time. For those of you who work in React and other like kind of component-based languages, this is kind of as close as Mako kind of gets to that, is the idea of inheritance. So we're going to talk about that right now. So inheritance in society, we might think of children inheriting a sum of money from a deceased parent. In biology, we might describe a child inheriting the genes of his or her parent. Well, in computer science, it's the same idea. There's a parent-child relationship, and in this case, index.html, which is our kind of root view, index.html actually inherits predefined properties from its parent, and in this case its parent is base.htm. And we can see how this is represented in the code by looking at the first line of index.html. It says inherit file equals base.htm, right? So it's telling the Django language and the preprocessors and everything that we want to inherit the contents of base.htm whenever index is loaded. And so that's kind of a lot to take in right there, right? But essentially what it means is that there are a lot of properties that are defined in HTML, right? In our head, for example, we have a title, we import a lot of stuff, we import scripts, we link stuff, we might have a nav bar too, right? Some of those things are things that we want to be consistent across the entire site. And so what inheritance allows us to do is kind of predefine a template for all of our code, right? So for example, this base.htm is typically the template that we use when we're working on a DMP project, right? So everything that you see in base.htm will actually be transferred over to index.html. And a good way of kind of seeing this and making sure that this is accurate and I'm not just saying stuff, right, is if we come over and view the page source, you'll see in here we're on index, right? We're not on base, but index inherits all of the script tags, the title tag, right? The header is right here. All of that was inherited from base.htm. So this one line of code right here, this first line, is a really important line to know. It'll be something that'll come up a lot in Django. Every time you create a new template, you're going to be wanting to probably inherit from something, typically. Sometimes there are examples where we don't do that, but most of the time we want to inherit. And so that's kind of the gist of inheritance, right? Is that properties from one file are kind of taken into another file, and it all happens through this one tag, the inherit tag. So you may be wondering how this, kind of all ties together, right? Like how does the content actually get sent and kind of merged in between the two pages? And we're going to talk about that next, well, in our discussion about blocks. So Django blocks are a really, really helpful and cool concept. And what they do is that they're defined on almost every page. If you're using semantic Mako, we'll have a block in it. And that includes the parent pages as well as the child pages. Because if you go over here to our main tag, you see that main has a block with name equals content in it. And if we go over to HTML or index.html, we also see that there is a block name content in this too. And this is interesting. This system of blocks is actually how we transfer the inheritance information from one file to another one. Basically what we're doing is in base.htm we're kind of allocating an area in the HTML file where the code is going to kind of be injected into, if that makes any sense. So it might make a little bit more sense if we go back to our source, right? Take a look at line 27. We look at main, and main has the div that is in index.html, right? It has this, but within the main, right? And so basically the way that I view inheritance and blocks in Django Mako is I think of it kind of like a hamburger, right? Typically, unless you're kind of weird, right? But I'll assume that most people eat hamburgers with a bun, right? The top half of a bun and the bottom half of a bun on either side of everything that goes in the hamburger, right? And it can be said the same for a sandwich. A sandwich might be a better analogy here, right? You have two slices of bread, and those two slices of bread are almost always pretty consistent no matter what sandwich you make, right? But everything in between the two slices of bread could be anything, right? It could be peanut butter and jelly all the way to, like a steak sandwich, right? Like a really high end kind of thing, right? That's the same way that base works, right? Base is kind of like our two pieces of bread. And I see this analogy really well, and it might not work for you, but everything basically above this block tag is the top half of the sandwich, right? It's the top bread, and everything below below this block is the bottom piece of bread. And then what we're going to do is, using inheritance and blocks, we're going to kind of take a whole bunch of different code and make it so that it fits in between the two pieces of bread, so that the bread is always consistent, but we might have a different sandwich depending on what pages we go to, right? And so in this instance, this block name is content. And if we go over to index.html, this block name is also content. But what happens if, say we defined another block? So let's think about this for a second. In this instance, the sandwich analogy kind of gets torn apart, right? Where we have kind of two places where we can render dynamic content using inheritance. So let's go ahead, and you're welcome to do this with me. I encourage it. Let's make another block right here, and let's name it head, right? This is in our head tag, right? So I feel like that's an appropriate name there. And we'll close the block. And there we go. And what we can do is we can actually go back to the site and rerun this page. Here we go. We can rerun the page, and nothing happens, right? We've kind of just created an empty block where we're telling Django, like, hey, you can put stuff here if you want to. So let's do that. Let's go over to index.html. And because we've inherited from base, right, because of that super important line right there, we're able to kind of tell the renderer that we want to send certain content from this section right here, which is block name equals head, and then we'll close our block, and we're going to say that everything within this section we want to have it sent over to kind of that same predefined section that we made in base.htm, right? So block name equals head, block name equals head, right? So we should be good here. So a cool thing to do here is maybe we can make the title of the website kind of dynamic based on what page you're on. So what we'll do is we'll put this within the index file. So let's come over here and say title, and then we'll say that we'll say this is index, and that will be the title. What we can do is we can come over here, refresh, and you can see up here on our tab, we've changed the title of the page to this is index. And this is what blocks do, and it gives us a lot of power and real control over our code, and kind of makes it so that kind of different components can fit in different places, right? So we can have specific head code go up there, specific content code go down there. We could make another block for the footer where we send footer code depending on the page that you're on, right? So blocks are this way that we can kind of work with a template, and by a template I don't mean an HTML file, but like an actual templated kind of outline, right? So we know basically, I mean, this is what Django suggests, right? We know that on most pages we're probably going to want this Ajax script, right? So we put it in base because that's going to load on all pages that inherit from base. And so this is a really cool concept. And exploring blocks is going to be something that is kind of gradual, and you'll work up to harder and harder things, and same with inheritance. But to get started, this is a great thing to learn, and something that is truly important to the Mako language. So this is the syntax that's truly important right here. Is block name equals head. The name has to equal what it does. It has to be the same spelling and capitalization as the block defined in the file you're inheriting from. And so that's kind of how blocks work. They can send different pieces of code to different sections of the parent class. Okay, the next thing that we're going to be talking about is Django Mako Plus Auto Linking. And this is a really, really fascinating concept that Django does. So online, for me, it's line 16 now. It's probably changed for you. But right at the very end of your head tag, you'll see that there's this special kind of weird looking syntax. It's definitely not HTML. And what this is, it's called Mako. It's Mako syntax, kind of like these block tags that we defined here. But what this line is doing is it's making a call to Django Mako Plus, which is the main kind of library for Django Mako Plus projects, right? And it's calling a link method, and it's telling the server to link a bunch of things to this page. And so this is really interesting because what does this output on the kind of front end, right? So this is at the very end of our head. Let's go back to our page source and refresh. You'll see that at the very end of our head, we have these three kind of scripts we have one script and two links that are kind of injected here. And one of them is to base.css, another is to index.css, and another is to index.js. And so what we're doing, what's going on kind of in the background with this is it's taking the current page you're on, right? And this isn't actually base that we're on, right? According to what Django thinks, right? We're on index. That's the page that we're on. We're not on base. We're on index. So it's going to go ahead and say, okay, let's go and find what links are appropriate to put on the index page. And so you can see that examples of this are index.css and index.js, and also base.css. And the reason it imports base.css is that we inherit from base.htm. So it's going to bring in all of the inherited kind of other links as well. And so if you don't really get how this is working yet, let's figure out an example that we can show you here. So what we're going to do is, to kind of get a better understanding of the file system, we're going to go ahead and create new file, and we're going to call this page, let's say that we're making an e-commerce site. Let's name it checkout.html. Within checkout.html, let's go ahead and write out the inherent links as well as the block tags, and we're going to go ahead and just empty out both blocks completely. And then in the content block, we can go ahead and say, let's call it, let's just give it an H2 in here, and we'll say, hi, this is, or let's say, hey, you're checking out. Fantastic. And then we can give it a title too, because we put that head tag, the head block in here for something special, and that was just this, so that we could have different titles on different pages. So let's go ahead and name it checkout, and we'll save that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go back over to the site, and we're going to go to /checkout. And when we go to /checkout, you'll see that we have the H2 that we put in here, right? It's like, hey, you're checking out, right? But let's go ahead and view the page source on this one. You'll notice I have both page sources open here. The index page source has these links to base.css, index.css, and index.js. If we go over to the checkout one, it only has a link to base.css. And the reason for that is that we don't actually have a defined checkout.css. But let's say that we did, right? Let's create a checkout.css. And what happens in the background is, if it's going to check for the name of the HTML file, and it's going to go ahead and say, okay, let's go find a style that has that same name. So if this is called checkout, it's going to search for your style in your styles folder. It's going to search for a file called checkout.css. And so it searches for that, and it's like, oh, hey, now I found it. So let's go ahead and import this. And just to prove this, we're going to go ahead and add an attribute to all H2s that say display none. And so if our H2 is hidden, we know that it's been imported correctly into the site. So we refresh, and boom, the H2 is gone. Let's go ahead and refresh our checkout. You'll notice that we have another link now. The link was made to checkout.css, and this is why I think Django is so fascinating, is that we can call these methods that make our lives so much easier, and this line is a line that makes our lives so much easier, because we don't have to go ahead and define a whole bunch of links, and say link, style sheet, blah blah blah, here's the relative link to it, and then if that link changes, then we got to go fix it. No, all it is it's really simple. You name the title, you name the title of the file the same as the title of the HTML file, right? And we can prove that this is the same with scripts, so let's go ahead and do it, just because we like to prove things here. So checkout.js, on checkout.js, I'm just going to alert hello, which is a very basic JavaScript function. And then we're going to go ahead and we'll refresh checkout and refresh it, and it says hello. And then we go back to the checkout source, and we see that voila, we have another tag. It's a script tag that links to checkout.js. And so this is what that one tag in base.htm does, is that it takes all the links with the same name as self, right? And self is the name of the page you're on, right? So it's going to take this, it's going to say, okay, checkout. Let's go see if there is a checkout.css and a checkout.js, and if there are, boom, we're going to import them. And while we're at it, since we're inheriting from base, let's go ahead and bring in the base.css as well while we're at it. And so that's what the links function does, and you're going to want to know this going forward with the test and everything, as well as just in your own personal projects, right? If you can very well just delete this, right, and link everything yourself. But once again, this is something that Django does for you, and it's a really cool and fascinating concept in my mind. Okay, so now we're on to the next kind of phase. And this phase is going to not as much involve base.htm anymore. So let's close that. And while working with checkout.html has been fun, let's go ahead and wrap up all the checkout things and just close those as well so that we're back to index.html. Right? And so I want to talk about one of the things that's in this file that might look a little weird to you. And it might look also similar to what you saw in base.htm, where we're making the links from the Django Mako Plus library. And it's right here on line 12 for me. It says current time in UTC, and then it has a $, opening bracket, opening curly bracket, and it says UTC underscore time, end curly bracket. So let's go ahead and see what's going on in our on our front end here. I'm going to navigate back to /index, and when I do that, you'll see current time in UTC, and then it just spits out a whole bunch of numbers, right? And I mentioned before that this is called a timestamp, and so if we refresh the page, you'll notice that those numbers are changing. It changes every time the page is loaded, which is fascinating, and this is where we get into kind of true Mako and dynamic content, right? Static content would be if I just said, okay, today's date is July 19th, 2019, right? And I just left that there, right? And every time I reloaded the page, it wouldn't change at all. But now we're working with dynamic content. And so now we're going to talk about DMP Context. And this is where we actually start to get into Python a little bit. And so all the Python on the site is stored in views. So there's a folder called views here. And we note that upon the creation of our project, there's one Python file, and it's called index.py. And so we can go ahead and open that up. If you don't know the basics of Python, I highly encourage that you do a little bit of research and study in your own time on Codecademy. That's a great place to learn the basics of Python. Truthfully, if you went through the whole Codecademy course, you'd be able to do all the Python really necessary for working in Django. Django is a super easy framework that just takes a little bit of time to get used to. And so what we have here is we have the first 3 lines are some imports, and I won't talk about these too much, but these are pretty basic imports that we use a lot in Django. And then we have a view function and we have a defined kind of method here called process request. And what this does is when you have these combinations right here, right? Line 5 is called a decorator. It's notated by that @ sign. When that view function decorator goes in front of a process request function, then this is like kind of this is the main function that will run when the page is loaded by default, right? And so for those of you who have worked in Java or C++ before, or one of those other programming languages, it's a lot like the main function in there, right? It's the kind of the first function to be run on the page by default. And so within process request, we have something called UTC time, which if you go back to here, we were referencing something called UTC time in our index.html. So this is kind of what I want to talk about here, and this is where we're going to get into the definition of context and what that means. And so I'm going to space out my code just a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. But you don't really have to know what datetime.utc now is doing, although I'll tell you it's outputting the current timestamp, and that's all it's doing, right? And so you could see that when we came over to here, right, and we refresh, it's just refreshing the current time, and it's saving that to UTC time, right? And so and then this next part right here, lines 10 through 15 on my screen, is kind of an interesting thing. It's called the context, right? And this is something that is slightly different about Python and HTML and that kind of thing, right? Is that the context is how we send in certain things to the HTML, right? You can imagine that everything that we define in Python, if we want to use it in our HTML, we have to kind of send it through like a gateway, kind of like a portal that will take our variables and push them through to the HTML. And that's exactly what the context function, or sorry, not function, context dictionary does. And so if you don't know what a dictionary is a set of a key value pairs, essentially, right? So on this side, we have how we reference the element, right? We're going to reference it by calling UTC time, and then this is what the element actually has within it, kind of, right? So whenever we call UTC time, it's going to spit out whatever UTC time the variable means, right? And so really quickly, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to delete the datetime dot now. And what we're going to do is let's change this to something else, right? Let's change it to a string that says hello world. That's a good thing to start with. And when we do this, we'll click save. And we're going to go back into our index file. And when we reload the page, it's going to give us an error letting us know that there's no attribute timestamp, and that's because I'm referencing UTC timestamp here. So we're going to go ahead and just cut this off for a second. There we go. And now let's just have the empty context, or sorry, not empty context. Just have the context with UTC time and UTC time in it, and we'll refresh. And what happens is when we go back to the current time in UTC, it outputs hello world, right? And I'll actually go ahead and refresh this a couple times to show you that now this looks kind of static, right? Because I refresh it, nothing's really changing, and so it looks static. But what we're really doing is we're creating data to be accessed. We're creating data within our Python that's going to be accessed within our HTML, right? And this example right here of the UTC time with hello world is really elementary and might not make a lot of sense for why we'd want to code that in Python and have it pushed to our HTML, right? But perhaps we want something slightly different. Let's say that we have kind of a variable that represents the number of users that are currently on the site, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make a variable called users, and we'll just set it equal to, like 5 or something, right? And what we can do with this is we can pass this in through the context is the way we would say that, right? We're going to pass a variable through the context, through the portal, into the HTML, right? So I'm going to go ahead and say that we're going to reference this variable by its same name. We're going to reference it by calling users, and that'll just give us 5 right here. So what we're going to do is within index.html, we're going to now go ahead and let's make a new tag. It's only appropriate to make an H5 now that we have an H3 and an H4 there. And we're going to say the current users are, and then what we're going to do is called it's Mako variable syntax, right? And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be calling a Python object that we passed into context, and we're just going to pop it right into the HTML and display it right there. So we called this users. So let's go ahead and save the file, go back to here, refresh, and we have this thing that says the current users on the site are 5, right? And so what we're doing, once again, is we're passing a variable from the Python into the front end HTML. And so we can go ahead and change this to whatever we want, right? We can say 8 here, and then we refresh the page, and now it says 8. There we go. And so how this is really working is through what we call a render function. So at the bottom of your process request, typically what we do on the last line is you return the render, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to give it a page to load. And we're telling it, okay, you're going to go find index.html, and into that you're going to pass the context. So you're going to go ahead and pass these variables so that they're accessible within the HTML, right? And so just to prove, kind of the fluidity of this render kind of function here, why don't we change it to checkout.html and just see what happens. If we refresh index, you'll see now we're getting our alert again, and we're actually on checkout, which is weird because it says we're on index, right? Well, this is how URLs work in Django Mako Plus. And so sit tight here because it's a little bit of an explanation, but if you want to know it, it's a great thing to learn. Whenever I route to something within my URL, what I'm really doing is I'm calling a Python file, right? So when I run /index, I'm going to my homepage views and I'm calling index. That's really what we're doing. By default, and so what you might ask this question, right, is that if I go to /checkout here, it still works just fine, but we don't actually have a checkout.py. What it does is that it will go in kind of an order of precedence, right? If you enter a page name right here into the route, and what it'll do after you push enter is that the Django will check. It'll say, okay, let's go ahead and try to find a view file that has the name checkout.py. And if one of those exists, great. We're going to run the process request function within that, and hopefully, if it's done correctly, it will return a template that I can output to the front end. But let's say that there's not a checkout.py. What it's going to do next is it's going to go to templates, and it's going to say, okay, perhaps this page doesn't need any Python logic, so perhaps the user just made it into an HTML file and left it at that. So what it's going to do is it's going to go into the templates folder and say, okay, is anything called checkout? And it'll be like, oh, okay, great. There is one called checkout. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to handle the rendering of this myself, and I'll just render it without any context really, because we don't have a Python file that we're sending in information to. And then the third option is if the page doesn't exist at all. So let's call this page video. And when I go there, nothing happens, right? Because it tried to find the Python file, and it tried to find the HTML file, but it couldn't find either. And proof of this is right here on this error line, right? It said discovery failed. View module homepage.views video not found. So that's it searching for the video, the video.py. And then it searches for a fallback. It's like, okay, let's look for video.html. And then it says, oh, that couldn't be loaded either. So this doesn't really exist on the site. So we don't know what to do. So we're just going to error, right? And so that's kind of how URLs and routing will work in DMP. And so I know that's a little bit hard to maybe wrap your head around, but it gets a lot more simple when you go, right? And so the first thing, so this might be a good time to, let's go ahead and create for ourselves a view. So we're going to call it checkout.py, right? And now what's going to happen is it's going to search and it's going to say, okay, there is a checkout.py now, so we're going to run that. So let's not put anything in this file. Let's go ahead and refresh checkout. When we do this, it's going to say that we found the homepage views checkout, but there was no process request in it. And once again, this is a required, method that needs to be in all of the Python files in order for it to work successfully with the URLs. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy, paste the index.py code. And we're going to send some new stuff this time to the context because the checkout page is a lot different. Let's go ahead and define our context dictionary. I'm going to send out something called price. And price in this instance might be for the price of the total cart or whatever, right? So we're going to say that this is like $500, right? And so that's an expensive purchase, but if we go back now and refresh checkout, you'll see that once again, everything's working just fine because we told it what to do. We have our view set up in Python, and then we told it to render checkout.html, and so that's what it's doing. And so what we can do now that we've rendered it, and now that we've passed in context to it, we can access this context from this page. So next to our H2, and actually I'm going to go back to our checkout.css and unhide this H2, as well as on checkout.js, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this alert here, and then we're going to be good to go. And so I'm going to go ahead and refresh this, and there we go. There's no more alert. Hey, you're checking out. Great, great, great. Okay, so let's go back to the checkout.html, and we created a Python variable called price and passed it into the context. And so once you've done those two things, you can do this special Mako syntax, which is $ opening curly bracket, and then the name of your variable within that, which is price, and then closing bracket. And what we're going to do is save that, refresh the page, and now you can see 500.0 is here on the front end for us to access, and that's all because we passed it into the context. Just for clarification, if you don't pass something into the context, it's going to get mad at you, and it's going to tell you that it's not defined, and so it gives you the undefined error, and you can read through this a little bit more, right, to find out exactly what is undefined, but it doesn't know what it is unless we pass it into context. So this makes Django really smart, right, because we can choose to give the HTML document access to certain things but not other things, right? And you want to be careful about what you put into context, right? You don't want to put in any super secure or secret information or anything like that, right? We only want to put in what we want to have accessible and viewable to the front end. So I think that that's all for the DMP context and calling variables in the front end. Let's go ahead and talk about something else really quickly, which comes default in the index.html, and that is the JSContext. So there's one other type of context kind of definition that we're going to want to talk about, and that's called JSContext. And so the context we've been working with so far takes variables from Python, right, and it sends it to the HTML. But what if we wanted to access a variable from JavaScript? And so this is a really cool concept that the creators of DMP added into the code base. And what it does is within our context, we can say, okay, JSContext, which is imported from Django Mako Plus up here on line 2. Let's pass in something to JSContext. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a variable called my name. And my name is Connor. So I'm going to put that here. Connor. There we go. That took me a long time to type. And what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, let's define a variable accessible in JavaScript called my name. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass into it my name. And then if we go over to index.js, you can see that this should already be in your code. It comes default with DMP. I'm going to go ahead. I erased the UTC epoch. I erased that from the context, so that's no longer even there anymore. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create an alert again. How about that? And I'll create an alert that prints my name. Oh, but first of all, we have to reference it from the context, right? Context, my name, and we're going to print that. And I'll explain this a little bit more in a minute, but let's just check to make sure it worked. If we come here, refresh. Oh, that's because I'm on checkout. I'm like, why is it not working? Let's go to index, and we get an undefined error. But that's because I'm trying to, sorry, if we go back to index.py, I'm still rendering checkout. I need to be rendering index.html. Got a little carried away there. Let's refresh this here, and you can see that when we do that, an alert pops up with my name. So what we just did is we passed in a Django variable to the JSContext. And for the record, anything that you pass into the JSContext can also be referenced in the index.html. So I can go out here and say, right next to users, you can say the user's name is, and then we'll put in our Mako syntax, my name. And then we go back here, refresh, it says Connor, and then it says his name is Connor, right? So anything passed into JSContext is also accessible in index.html. And so what we do with this in particular is if we go back to the index.js file, what needs to happen is that this all needs to be dependent on the DMP context.get, right? If I tried to reference the context outside of this kind of function right here that they set up, it wouldn't actually work. And so you need to be calling it within a function that passes in the context, and it's kind of formatted in this way that that Django Mako Plus already has set up for you in your index.py. And so that's kind of how it works with JSContext. And JSContext is really powerful because a lot of times you're going to need to send Python stuff to JS files, right? That's how we're going to start to get some really intuitive designs and cool concepts on websites is through context.js. And so, yeah, I think that's all for that section. Next, let's go ahead and talk about conditionals in Python. So I've been talking this whole time kind of about dynamic content, but once again, it doesn't seem super dynamic, right? Because we've been kind of just hard coding these numbers in and stuff and just passing them into the HTML. So what we're going to do is it's time to give our code some logic. So I'm going to go back to index.py and let's go ahead and erase our context as well as the variables we defined before, so we have a clean slate to kind of work with. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say, let's create a variable called age. And age, for right now, it can be 19. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to pass in a name as well, right? And my name is going to be Connor. And we'll pass both of these into the context. And so within context, we will say, we'll reference them by their same variable names in the front end. So age is represented by age. And then name is represented by name. My bad, that shouldn't be in a string. Name. And so once again, what this does is it's going to take 19 and pass it into here, and then it's now going to be callable by the keyword age. And so if we go back to the front end, what we can do is let's also erase this, because if we don't, all of the whole page is going to break because we're calling variables that are no longer in context. So let's give ourselves some space here. Let's go ahead and say, let's go ahead and put this in an H1 so it's nice and big. And what we can do is we can say, okay, name, which is what I believe I called the variable. Yep. So name is age years old, right? And that's pretty simple. Name is age years old. This should, from what we've seen before in our previous kind of things that we've mentioned in this video, is that it should say Connor is 19 years old. So let's go ahead back to index, refresh this. It's still printing the thing from before. I'll go change that in just a second, but it says Connor is 19 years old, which is perfect. Let's go to our index.js and go ahead and get rid of this alert, which is now undefined since we removed that from the JS context. Now you're on this page and it says Connor is 19 years old, which is perfect. But let's make this so that we're actually creating dynamic content now. And the way that we do this is we use conditionals, right? And so if you're familiar with any programming language, you know conditionals, right? In JavaScript and in every language, I can't think of a language where this isn't the case, right? But you have if and else statements, right? If this, then do this, but if it's not this, then do this, right? And that's kind of the premise of if else. And Mako can do that same thing so that we can generate kind of a conditional content on the front end of a website. So let's say if age, right? Age is something that we passed into context, so we can reference it here. If age is greater than 18, colon, and then what we're going to do is say end if, right? Which is something you don't typically have to do, but in Mako you have to let Mako know where the conditional starts, right? It's notated with %if, and then where it ends, which is %end if, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to say if age is greater than 18, let's display a little p tag that says you're an adult. And we're going to go ahead and save this, go back to Chrome, refresh, and it says you're an adult, which is awesome, right? Because it got it right, because I'm 19, which means I'm greater than 18. But let's say that my age was 17 years old. So let's go ahead back to index.py, change it to 17, and refresh the page. You'll see that now that I'm 17 years old, it doesn't actually tell me that I'm an adult anymore, which is really cool, right? That's dynamic content right there, right? Because if you're an adult, let's show them this. If you're not, let's show them this, right? That kind of thing. So another thing we can do is we can elaborate on this even more. If you're familiar with if statements, you're probably also familiar with if or else if and else, right? We're going to say else, right? So if you are younger than or equal to 18, then what we're going to do is we're going to say you are still a child. And I guess if we want to be like really accurate here, we would do greater than or equal to 18, because I suppose 18 is the age of adulthood. So if age is greater than 18, you're an adult, else you're still a child. So let's go ahead and refresh this page. And it says you're still a child right there, right on it. So let's go ahead and we'll try 18, since that's kind of our borderline. It should tell us we're an adult. And it says you're an adult, yay. So this is really cool. Once again, with conditionals, we can start to add dynamic content to our website. And so this is fascinating. We can also do things like this. So I can create a variable called is employed. And I can say none, right? And the none variable, or the none kind of keyword in Python is the same as null, right? It just doesn't exist. It doesn't have a value associated with it. I can pass in is employed, and we'll put this as is employed here. And then I'll go back to my index.html. And what we can do is we can say, we can make it super simple, right? If, if employment is defined, and actually what we should do is this naming makes it kind of sound like it's a Boolean, but it's not. It's not a Boolean. We don't want to get it confused. So let's just name it employment. Employment equals none. That's a great way of doing it. So employment. And what we'll do is if employment, right? If employment exists, right? Which is just saying if employment is not none. Then let's go ahead and display what kind of employment they have. So we'll do this using our special Mako syntax, where we print employment, right? And then I'll save this. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back here, refresh, and you'll see that nothing happens. And nothing happens because I'm not employed, right? Its employment doesn't equal anything, so it doesn't really exist. And that's what this syntax is doing right here. It's saying if this variable has value, right? If it has something, then let's go ahead and display it. Let's go ahead and give myself employment. I work at Brightbridge Web. Let's go back to the front end where we refresh and it says Brightbridge Web right there. So that's kind of an introduction to conditionals in Mako. And once again, another great way that we can kind of start adding dynamic content to websites. And so if you didn't know exactly the syntax on all of this, make sure that you refresh it on it and that you know how this works. It uses the exact same syntax as Python, except for two things. First of all, it requires the % in front to let Mako know that this is something that's conditional and something that that it needs to parse differently. And then the last thing is that it needs an end if. Mako needs to know where this stops because it can't tell that with indentation like Python can. And so with those things in mind, go forward now and make some cool conditional things. Really, this is where things really start to pick up in DMP for people, is where they start to learn how can we make conditional content on a website. Okay, so we just got done talking about if conditionals. Let's talk about another kind of branch that we can make within our Mako context. So I'm going to get rid of all the stuff we just worked on. So let's kind of have an empty content again. Once again, we'll go back to index.py, delete this, and we're going to start fresh. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a list. And a list in Python is it's like an array, right? It's a representation of objects kind of on a line, right? That's not the best way of describing it. But what you can do is you can save multiple objects to a single variable kind of with this. So this will make sense if we define string list, right? And so let's go ahead and start naming names of people at our company. We'll do Connor, we'll do Madison, we'll do Jordan, we'll do Enoch, and let's do Matthew because that includes a lot of people, and then Longy. And I'm sorry if I missed your names, but that's all we're gonna do for right now. And so this list it has a lot of different values, right? A lot of different string values assigned to one variable, and you'll learn about models later. But models in Django hold a lot of objects that are kind of saved to one variable, right? And so we're kind of going to mimic that using a vanilla Python list. So we can think of all these people as users on my site, right? So let's go ahead and say, let's go ahead and define what we'll reference this to in the front end as string list, and we'll pass in string list to that. And so now string list is passed into the context, which means I can use it in index.html. So what I kind of want to do is I want to take every name in this list and I want to output it in kind of, like a paragraph, like a p tag on the site. And so there's a lot of different ways we can do this, right? A really elementary way is to do this. So let's go ahead and define our Mako variable accessor right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to access from context the string list and at the index 0, right? And so what this should print is Connor, because Connor is at index 0 in this list. And so if we go back to index.html, refresh the page, you have Connor. And that's great, right? So let's go ahead and make like 1,000 more, right? And what we have here is we have 1, 2, and 3, and then we can go ahead, save that, and refresh, and look, oh my gosh, we're referencing our users, right? But this gets kind of tedious, right? We don't want to put 1, 2, 3, right? Because we could have thousands of users. So how on earth would I kind of display dynamic content in that way? How would I work with a list of things that could be any size, right? And I just have to kind of output all that information or do something with all that information. Well, we're in luck because there's something really, really cool, and this will come in handy so much as you're working on DMP projects, but it's called a for loop, a Mako for loop, right? We're doing this on the front end. So we're going to say for name in string list, and then we're going to do end for, right? It's a very similar kind of syntax. Oops, sorry, I did end if. We want to do end for. It's very similar in structure to the Mako if statement, right? You need the % sign at the front, and you need to end it with an end for, because Mako can't tell where you've stopped because it doesn't have the Python indentation rules that apply in HTML, right? It doesn't have, it has different indentation rules. And so what we're doing here is for name in string list. So what this is it's called a for each loop, right? We're going through each element of the list. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, for each of these, let's do something on each one, right? And so what we do is as we go through the list, we start at index 0. And that is kind of put into name temporarily, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to say p tag, and then in here we're going to put name. And name is something that we didn't pass into context, right? But we defined it right here within our loop, right? Because we're saying for name in string list, print out name. And you could actually call this whatever you want, and I'll show you some examples of that in a second. But let's just see what happens when we do this. I come over to the site and I refresh, and voila, we have Connor, Madison, Jordan, Enoch, Matthew, Longy. What we did is we just really condensed our code into one simple for loop that will output all of it. All of the names within the list, all of the objects and users on our site are like that. So we could say, you know, this is just a kind of arbitrary name, right? It's a naming convention that you give it that'll make sense, right? So we can do for string in string list, right? And it'll print the same thing. It's just saying for object in list, let's do something with that object, right? And in this case, we're printing it out fully. And so this is how the for statements kind of go. And so what you can do is you can access, and you'll learn how to do this later, but you can access every user on the site, right? Every object on the site, and then we can do something with all that information, right? And this is similar to how, you know, how kind of YouTube does it, right? If you look up YouTube and you go to youtube.com, you see a bunch of videos, right? They didn't hard code all those videos in there, right? They used some kind of loop that said, okay, for video in all of our videos, let's do this, right? And they condensed their code by millions of lines, right? Because they were able to kind of make it short and simple and sweet like that. And so that's something that's really cool that we're able to do in DMP, and that will help both save us code and help us create dynamic content. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is a for loop in Mako. Okay, you've stuck with me for a long time. We are almost done. There's one last thing that we need to talk about. I was mentioning before about the URL structure of these kind of sites. What we have, let's just reiterate it one more time, is that the name of the domain, right, which in this case is our local host at port 8000 /index. And /index is the name of the view that we are accessing, right? So in this case, it's index. If we did /checkout, we would be referencing checkout.py, right? And we'd be calling things in that way. So what we can do with this is we can actually pass in some pretty important things via the URL. And this is kind of another way to work with variables, right? We've been talking today, like, how do we send variables from the front end to the back end kind of thing, right? We've been talking about, let's make something in Python and then send it to the, we'll send it to the HTML, right? But we haven't really talked about any ways that we can send something from the HTML to the Python, right? And this could be one way of doing it. So what we have is we have /index, but we could go further than this. We could say /index /1 or 2, 3, 4, anything like that, right? And this page would still load, right? We just kind of have all these mumbo jumbo numbers here that don't really make any sense, right? And you'll see this in lots of other sites too, right? If you look at a YouTube video, for example, they'll have like all this kind of weird code, kind of like weird stuff in the URL that just spans on for a long time. And these are called URL parameters. It's a way for our URL to kind of communicate information to our view, right? And so what we're going to do is let's do index /2. And what this is called the first URL param, but it works a lot like an array, right? Which is that it starts at index 0. So we're going to go ahead right now. Something I didn't mention before is that there's this really, really important there's this really important argument that gets passed into process request, and that is the request argument. You're going to use request a lot, and this is just a very, very, very brief view of it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use request, and what request can do is it can obtain those URL parameters. So we're going to do request.dmp.url params at index 0, right? That is how you reference the index. That's how you reference the URL param that we just created, right? And this is important syntax. You need to know this. It will be it'll be crucial to you as you're going forward in your code to know about these kind of parameters and variables for your pages. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this equal to a variable which we'll call URL param 0, and we'll set it equal to that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass this into the context just so that we can get kind of an idea of what's going on, because we're going to go over to our index.htm and we'll just make a we'll make an h1 and we'll pass in URL. I think I copied it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, let's go to our index and we'll refresh the page, and you can see that right here we have once again, yeah, so here we are. We're at index/2, and now it's printing 2 here, right? What if we change this to 6? And then 6 gets printed, right? So what if it was nothing? It just doesn't exist. It's that simple. So if there is a URL parameter there, then we'll assign it to the variable, but if not, it's just kind of a null or none or blank value. And so we can put anything here, right? We can put Connor Matson, right? And that goes in there too. So there's a lot of really cool things that we can do with this, right? You can use URL parameters to reference a certain, a certain object within millions of objects, right? If you just want to display that one object, you could do so here. You'll note that we can have as many URL params as we want to, heaven forbid, right? So let's make 4 of them. We'll do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll pass all of these in as well, because why not? So 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and then we'll go back to the index and we will just copy a whole bunch of these so that we can talk about how these are made. 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. So now we're ready to go. So I can refresh and nothing's changed, and that's because we still only have one URL here, or URL parameter. So what if I did this? So what we have now, right, is that our URL is starting to get more complex, right? We have /index, which is the name of our view, and then /Connor Matson, which is the first URL parameter, but that's at position 0 in the index. So Connor Matson is 0, 1 is 1, 2 is 2, and 3 is 3. And so what we can do here is we can do anything we want. Once again, we can do Python, and we can do light switch. I'm just looking around my room at this point for strings that we can name this, right? And voila, they're there, right? So what we can do with this is we can pass in these things to the context. But there's something else that you should know that we won't get into a lot here because it's starting to verge on complex, right? But not when I said that everything had to be passed into the context earlier, that was a little bit of a lie, because some things are already passed into the context, and one of those things is that really special thing I was telling you about, the request argument. And so what we could do if we wanted to was we can leave all this passing into the context, but I could just go right here and say request.dmp.url params 0, right? And then I'll just copy this 4 times, and we'll do 1, 2, and 3, and this will actually work the exact same way because we have access to request in this front end. So I'm going to refresh, same thing runs, and it runs beautifully. And so this is just a small step into your Mako journey, right? We've talked about a lot today. We've talked about inheritance, we've talked about DMP Auto Linking, we've talked about blocks, we've talked about DMP Context, calling variables from the front end, JSContext, and calling variables from JavaScript. We've talked about if conditionals and for loops and URL parameters. Wow. We've gone through a lot, and a lot of this stuff, like I said, if you've been working here for a fair amount of time, you probably know a lot of this, but you know, there's a lot of really important things that you need to know that are building blocks into some of the things that we're going to be teaching you over this quarter. And so this month for sure, the month of July, is very much just kind of like a let's make sure everyone's on the same level and they know their stuff. And this Mako stuff is so fundamental, you guys. Really important to learn, and I'm so glad that if you made it through the whole video, right, and if you've been following along and watching, I'm really thankful that you took the time to do this and that you've took the time to learn about this on your own, because this is really cool stuff. So if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to come to the office and talk to me about them. Ask me anything. I'd love to learn more and learn more with you, right? And so once again, thank you so much for watching, and good luck as you code. If you know kind of the 7 or 8 basic things that we've talked about in this video, you're going to be excellent on the test. Good luck, and thank you so much.